55 years. That's how long I kept a secret that nearly destroyed my family and made me lose the only thing I fought for my entire life: our home. Good morning, my dears. My name is Martha. I'm 80 years old, and today I want to share with you a story I've never told anyone except my family. A story of regret, forgiveness, and above all, true love. Before I begin, I'd like to ask you who are watching now to please leave a like on this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love knowing my words are reaching so many different places across America. I was born in Morgantown, West Virginia in 1945. Times were tough, but simple. My father worked in the coal mines, and my mother took care of me and my younger sister, Dorothy. We grew up together, sharing cloth dolls our mother made and dreaming about the day we'd have our own families. When I turned 18, I met Thomas. He worked in his father's carpentry shop and had calloused hands from working with wood all day. He was a serious, respectful, hard-working young man. He wasn't one for many words, but when he looked at me, his eyes said everything. We started dating with my father's permission, always very respectfully. Thomas would come over on Sundays after church, sit in the living room with the whole family, and we'd talk while having coffee with the butter cookies my mother made. After 2 years of courtship, he proposed to me. Back then, things were different, you know? An engagement was a serious commitment, almost as serious as marriage itself. We set the date for December 1969 and started saving every penny to fulfill our dream, having our own little house. But life has its plans, and they don't always match ours. In September of that year, 3 months before our wedding, Thomas's father had a stroke in Pittsburgh, where he lived with his second wife. Thomas was his only son and had no choice but to travel to take care of his father. "I'll be back in time for our wedding," he promised before leaving, and I believed him. The weeks began to pass, slowly and lonely. I sewed my wedding dress at night after returning from my job at the fabric store downtown. It was a simple dress, but I put all my love into every stitch. Thomas's letters arrived, bringing news, not always encouraging, about his father's health. The recovery time would be longer than expected. It was during this period that Richard returned to town. Richard had been my first love, that teenage love you never completely forget. He had left for New York when we were 16, and I hadn't heard from him in years. Now he was back, full of stories about travels through Europe, about working in big companies, with a way of speaking that enchanted me. I ran into him by chance in the town square one Sunday afternoon after church. I was alone, sitting on a bench reading a book Thomas had given me before he left. Richard approached, and it was as if time hadn't passed. We started talking, and without realizing it, spent the whole afternoon together. "You're still as beautiful as ever, Martha," he told me. I know I should have told him right away that I was engaged, that I was getting married soon, but the words wouldn't come out. Perhaps out of vanity, perhaps from a foolish desire to relive that first love, I kept silent about my engagement. In the following weeks, Richard and I met several times. He told me about Paris, about London, about places I only knew from books and never imagined I could visit. In October, when I received Thomas's letter saying he needed to stay another month in Pittsburgh, something inside me changed. I felt abandoned, afraid he might never come back, that he might find someone in the big city. It was on a rainy night, after dinner, at the only fancy restaurant in town, that Richard kissed me. I know I should have resisted, that I should have been faithful to my commitment to Thomas. But at that moment, with Richard's promises to take me with him to Portugal where he was going to work, I let myself be carried away. It was a weakness I would pay for the rest of my life. For 3 weeks I lived a dream. Richard talked about marriage, about traveling together, about seeing the world. I started to imagine a different life from the one I had planned with Thomas. A life of adventures, of new places. Until one November morning, Richard came to see me with a different look on his face. "I need to leave next week, Martha," he said. "The company in Portugal needs me urgently." "And what about us?" I asked, feeling my heart tighten. "You know I care for you, but I can't take you with me now. Maybe in the future." Those words fell like a bucket of cold water. Richard had never talked about taking me now, always in future plans. I realized I had been deceived, that for him I was just a passing adventure in a small town. A week later, he left, leaving only a brief note. "I'll always keep you in my heart, Richard." I was devastated, but the worst was yet to come. 2 weeks after Richard's departure, I discovered I was pregnant. My world fell apart. What would I do? How would I tell Thomas? It would be the end of our engagement, of our story. My family would throw me out of the house. I would be the shame of the town. During those days, I cried more than in my entire life. That's when I received Thomas's letter. He was coming back. His father was better, and our wedding would take place as planned. At that moment, I made the decision that would change my entire life. I wouldn't tell Thomas anything. I hid my pregnancy as much as I could, and when we married in December, I was already almost 2 months along. When Robert was born 7 months after the wedding, I told everyone he was premature. People talked behind our backs, of course, but Thomas believed me, or at least pretended to. He held that baby in his arms with so much love, with such tenderness, that my heart broke into 1,000 pieces, knowing the lie I was living. Shortly after Robert's birth, we decided to start over somewhere else. Thomas found work in Burlington, Vermont, and that's where we went, leaving behind the town that knew my secret. In Burlington, nobody knew our history. We were just a young couple with a baby trying to build a life. The years went by, and Robert grew up strong and healthy. Thomas raised him as if he were his own blood, teaching him everything he knew, working twice as hard to give him opportunities we never had. With great sacrifice, we managed to buy a small house in the historic district of town. It was small, needed renovations, but it was ours, the place where we raised our son, where we celebrated birthdays, Christmases, graduations. Robert graduated as an engineer, got married, gave us grandchildren. Thomas retired from construction work with his health already compromised by years of heavy labor. And I continued carrying my secret year after year, decade after decade. Sometimes, when I looked at Robert and saw traces of Richard in him, in his smile, in his way of walking, I felt a tightness in my chest, a constant fear that one day the truth would come to light. And that day came 55 years later, from where I least expected it, from my own sister. Dorothy always had a difficult life. She married and divorced several times, never achieving stability. She envied what we had built, our united family, our own little house. In 2014, she came to stay with us for a while, saying she needed time to reorganize after yet another failed relationship. One afternoon, while I was arranging an old cabinet, Dorothy offered to help me. Among boxes of photographs and old documents was my diary from that time, the diary where, young and desperate, I had written about Richard, about my pregnancy, about my fear of losing Thomas. I never had the courage to get rid of those pages. It was as if they held a part of me that nobody knew. I didn't notice when Dorothy took the diary. I only found out weeks later when she came to me with a strange smile on her face. "We need to talk, little sister," she said, holding my diary in her hands. "I discovered something very interesting about your dear Robert." My blood froze. After so many years, my greatest fear was becoming reality. Dorothy explained she was in serious financial trouble. She had invested all her savings in a small business that failed, and now creditors were after her. She needed money, and fast. "Either you give me your house, or I'll tell Thomas that Robert isn't his son." Those words hit me like a slap. My own sister blackmailing me, threatening to destroy the peace we had built with so much sacrifice. Thomas was already 75, had recently suffered a heart attack. How would he react to knowing he had lived a lie throughout our life together? I begged Dorothy, offered our savings, but she was inflexible. She wanted the house, nothing less. After a sleepless night, I gave in. I transferred the deed to her name on the condition that she would never, ever reveal the truth to Thomas or Robert. I invented for my husband and son that we needed to sell the house to pay for advanced medical treatments that the health insurance wouldn't cover for surgeries Thomas would soon need. They didn't question it. They trusted me. We moved to a small rented apartment far from the center, while Dorothy sold our house for a price well below market value, desperate to get the money she needed. Seeing Thomas in that cramped apartment, away from the garden he tended with such care, away from the memories we built together, was a pain that consumed me day after day. But what tormented me most was knowing that even after 5 decades, I still hadn't had the courage to face my truth. Robert, always attentive, began to notice something wasn't right. He investigated, talked to doctors, discovered there was no need for those surgeries I had invented, and worse, discovered the house had been sold for much less than it was worth. The walls were closing in, and I knew I could no longer run from the truth. That's when I made the hardest decision of my life, to tell everything, to risk losing the 2 people I loved most in the world, but finally free myself from the weight I had carried since I was 24. At least this time, the truth would come from my lips and not as a weapon in my sister's mouth. I invited them both for a simple dinner in that cramped apartment. I made the cornbread that Thomas loved so much, the fried chicken that was Robert's favorite. When we finished eating, I asked them to stay at the table. My hands were shaking, my voice faltering, but I knew it was time. "I have something to tell you, something I should have said a long time ago." And so began the night that would change our lives forever. Once more that night, my God, how difficult it was. My legs were shaking so much I thought I couldn't stand. The silence at the table was so heavy I could hear the old clock on the wall, the same one Thomas had fixed when we moved into our first house. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Each second seemed like an eternity. "I have something to tell you," I began, my voice barely a whisper. "Something I've kept for over 50 years. I looked into the eyes of my Thomas, those brown eyes that had always looked at me with so much love, even on the hardest days. Then to Robert, our son. Yes, our son, because no matter what blood might say, it was Thomas who raised him, who loved him from day one. In 1969, when your father traveled to Pittsburgh to care for your grandfather, I made a mistake." The words came with difficulty, as if each one tore away a piece of me. "I met Richard, an old boyfriend from my youth. He had just returned from Europe, full of stories, promises." Thomas kept his gaze fixed on me, motionless as a statue. Robert frowned, confused, not understanding where I was going. "I got involved with him. It was brief, it was a mistake, but it happened. When your father returned, I was already pregnant. There, it was said. The secret I carried for decades was now exposed on the table in that cramped apartment, like a strange object that no one knew how to touch. Robert was the first to react. "Mom, what are you saying? That my father is not—" I couldn't finish hearing him. Tears blurred my vision. Yes, that's what I was saying. That the man he called father his entire life, who taught him to ride a bicycle, who took him fishing in the Green River on sunny Sundays, who worked 2 jobs to pay for his engineering college, was not his biological father. "Thomas," I called, seeking his eyes. But he was no longer looking at me. It was as if something broke inside him. In an abrupt movement, he stood up, knocking over the chair. His face, always so serene, transformed into a mask of fury and pain I had never seen before. 55 years, he shouted, pounding the table so hard the plates jumped. 55 years of lies. Dad, please calm down, Robert tried to intervene, also standing up. Don't call me Dad, Thomas thundered, the veins in his neck bulging. I am not your father. Ask your mother who your father is. Ask her about Richard. The way he pronounced that name was as if he were spitting it out, as if it were the worst possible offense. Thomas, who in all our married life had never raised his voice to me, now trembled with anger. You made me raise another man's child, thinking he was my blood. How could you, Martha? He grabbed his coat hanging near the door and left, slamming the door so hard that the old clock fell from the wall, breaking on the floor. A perfect metaphor for what had just happened to our family. Robert stood still, as if not knowing what to do. I saw in his eyes the 5-year-old boy who came running to show me his loose baby tooth, the teenager who confided in me about his first love, the man who gave me his first paycheck as an engineer saying, "Save it for you and Dad. You deserve it." "Why, Mom?" he finally asked, his voice choked. "Why now, after so long?" I told him everything about Dorothy's blackmail, about how she had found my old diary, about how she had forced us to sell the house in exchange for her silence. As I spoke, I saw my son's face move from confusion to disbelief, and finally to anger. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. "And where is Richard now?" "I don't know," I answered honestly. I never heard from him again after he left. He didn't even know about the pregnancy. Robert paced back and forth in the small living room, running his hands through his hair. A gesture so similar to Richard's that my heart ached. I need to process all this. I need some air. He left too, more contained than Thomas, but equally shaken. And I was left alone in that apartment, sitting at the table with the dinner leftovers, the broken clock on the floor marking the end of an era in our lives. That was the longest night of my life. I didn't sleep a minute. I sat in the living room armchair, looking at the phone, praying for one of them to call, to return. I thought about the more than 50 years with Thomas, about the good and bad moments we shared, about the struggles and victories. Would all this be erased because of a mistake made even before we were married? The next morning, Robert returned. He was worn out, with deep, dark circles, but calmer. He sat in front of me and took my hands in his. "Mom, what you did was wrong. The lie was wrong. But I understand the fear you felt. Those were different times, and you were young." Tears ran down my face as he spoke. My son, my boy, now a 55-year-old man, comforting me when I should be comforting him. "As for my father, Thomas," he corrected. That correction tore me apart inside. "He's going to need time, a lot to digest at once. Do you know where he is?" I asked anxiously. "At Joe's place, that friend of his from the carpentry shop. He's physically fine, at least, but he doesn't want to talk to you yet." The following days were a nightmare. Robert returned to his home in the capital, promising he would try to talk to Thomas, try to make him understand. I stayed alone in the apartment for the first time in 55 years of marriage. Thomas wouldn't answer my calls, wouldn't respond to the messages I left with Joe. On the third day, I was so desperate I went to his friend's house. Joe, always so cheerful and talkative, received me with a serious expression at the door. "He doesn't want to see you, Martha," he said bluntly. "Please, give the man time," I begged, tears already flowing freely down my face. "Just tell him I'm sorry, that I love him more than anything, that these 55 years weren't a lie." Joe sighed, running his hand through his gray beard. "I'll tell him, but I can't promise anything." I returned to the apartment and waited 1 hour, 2 hours, the entire afternoon. When the sky was already darkening and I had lost hope, I heard knocks on the door. It was him, my Thomas. He was worn out, with deep dark circles. He seemed to have aged years and days. He wore the same blue shirt he had left the house in 3 days before, now wrinkled. He entered without saying a word and sat heavily on the couch. "Thomas," I began, but he raised his hand, asking for silence. "Let me speak first, Martha." His voice was hoarse, tired. "I spent these days thinking about everything we've lived through. At first I could only feel anger, an anger I've never felt in my life. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to forget you existed." His words cut me like knives, but I knew I deserved every one of them. Then I started to remember. His voice faltered. "I remembered the day Robert was born, so small in my hands, with that little birthmark on his shoulder that I thought came from my grandfather." He gave a sad smile and continued. "I remembered his first step, his first word, which was Dada. Did you know? You were in the kitchen and didn't hear. I remembered when he fell off his bike and split his eyebrow, and I took him rushing to the hospital, more desperate than he was." Silent tears ran down my husband's wrinkled face. "I remembered his graduation, how proud I felt seeing my son get his engineering diploma, the first in the family. His wedding, when he placed our newborn granddaughter in my arms and said, 'Grandpa, hold her carefully.'" Thomas took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with difficulty. When his tearful eyes finally met mine, I saw a mixture of pain and love that left me breathless. For 55 years, I watched this boy be born, grow up, and become a man. I taught him to ride a bike, to fish, to be honest. I held him when he cried and was proud of every achievement of his. He paused, as if searching for the right words. If that's not being a father, then I don't know what is. I couldn't take it anymore. I fell to my knees in front of him, holding his calloused hands. "Forgive me, Thomas. Forgive me for not trusting you, for lying all these years." He pulled me to sit beside him on the couch. "It hurts, Martha. It hurts a lot to know you hid this from me. But I've lived too long to throw away an entire life because of a mistake from the past. Robert is my son. Not by blood, but by every moment we've lived together." At that moment, we heard the door open. It was Robert. He had a spare key since we moved. Seeing Thomas, he stood frozen at the entrance, as if not knowing if he was welcome. "Come in, son," Thomas called, extending his hand. "Come here." Robert approached hesitantly. Thomas stood up and, in a movement that surprised me, hugged him tightly. "I'm sorry for what I said," he murmured. "You are my son. You always have been, always will be." Robert, that strong man, almost 6 feet tall, broke down in his father's arms, sobbing like a little boy. "You're the only father I know, the only one I want to know." The three of us stood there embracing, crying together. A wounded family, but still a family. At that moment, I felt that perhaps we could overcome this, that perhaps there was enough forgiveness to heal 5 decades of lies. But we still had one issue to resolve: Dorothy and the house she had taken from us. I didn't tell everything just to ease my conscience, I explained when we were calmer. Dorothy is selling our house, the house we built with so much sacrifice. Robert frowned. That's blackmail, Mom. It's a crime. And what can we do? I asked, feeling helpless. If we report her, the whole town will know our story. It was Thomas who surprised us both. Let them know, he said with a firmness I hadn't seen in a long time. I'm not ashamed of having raised you as my son, Robert, and I won't let that woman take from us the fruit of a lifetime of work. Something in his expression, in the strength returning to his eyes, reminded me of the young Thomas I met so many years ago, the determined man who didn't bend in the face of difficulties. Tomorrow we'll find a lawyer, he continued, and we'll get back what's ours. That night, for the first time in days, I managed to sleep. A light sleep, true, still laden with worries, but beside my husband, in the same bed we had shared for more than half a century. Things would never be the same as before. There was a crack in our story that would never completely close. But perhaps, just perhaps, we could build something new from there. And it was with that hope that I woke up the next morning, ready to confront my sister and recover not just our house, but our dignity. Early that morning, the three of us went out together for the first time since the revelation. The day was beautiful, a blue sky like only Vermont has, without a single cloud. Ironically, the weather seemed to mock the storm we were living through. Robert drove his car while Thomas and I sat in the back, holding hands. A simple gesture that a few days ago I feared I might never feel again. Our first destination was the office of Mr. Paul Mendez, a young but well-respected lawyer. Son of the old pharmacist, he had studied in the capital and returned to open his office in Burlington. Robert knew him from college days. The three of us entered the modest but well-kept office. I was trembling inside. Telling our secret to the family had already been one of the hardest moments of my life. Now we would have to expose it to a stranger, but there was no alternative if we wanted to get our house back. Mrs. Martha, Mr. Thomas, what a pleasure to receive you. Mr. Mendez greeted us with a polite smile. He couldn't imagine what we were about to reveal. For almost an hour, I told the whole story. The affair with Richard in 1969, the hidden pregnancy, Robert's birth, the 55 years of secrecy. And finally, how Dorothy found my old diary and blackmailed me to take our house. The lawyer listened to everything without interrupting, only making occasional notes. His young face maintained a professional expression without judgment, something for which I was silently grateful. When I finished, he adjusted his glasses and looked directly at the three of us. What your sister did, Mrs. Martha, is extortion, a crime under the penal code, he said seriously. We have a solid case to annul the property transfer, besides possibly opening a criminal case against her. Criminal? I choked on the word. Despite everything, Dorothy was still my sister, the girl with whom I shared cloth dolls, with whom I learned to make pastries in our mother's kitchen. That depends on what you want, the lawyer explained patiently. We can focus just on recovering the property without entering the criminal sphere if you prefer. I looked at Thomas, seeking his opinion. Our eyes met in one of those moments of silent understanding that only 50 years of marriage can provide. We just want our house back, Thomas said. We don't need to see Dorothy in jail. Mr. Mendez nodded. I understand. We'll need evidence of the extortion, though. The diary would be important evidence, but I imagine it's with your sister. That's when Robert spoke up. Actually, I have something that might help. He took his phone from his pocket and showed it to the lawyer. I recorded a conversation with Aunt Dorothy last night. I was surprised. I didn't know my son had approached Dorothy. I went to see her, Robert explained, seeing my expression. I said I wanted to understand what had happened. She boasted about how clever she had been, how she had gotten the better of us. It's all recorded here. Mr. Mendez listened to a portion of the recording, and a confident smile appeared on his face. This changes everything. With this evidence, we can take immediate action. The property transfer will be nullified for having been obtained through coercion. We left the office with a strange feeling of relief mixed with apprehension. On one hand, there was hope of recovering our house. On the other, I knew we would have to confront Dorothy and that the relationship with my sister, already complicated, would never be the same. We need to talk to her before the court officer arrives with the notification, I said when we were in the car. I need to look her in the eyes, understand how she was capable of this. Robert hesitated. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Mom. She might get aggressive, might try to deny everything. Your mother is right, Thomas intervened. Some things need to be said face to face. And so, instead of returning to the apartment, we asked Robert to take us to our old house, now occupied by Dorothy. The feeling of returning to that place was indescribable. The house where we spent most of our lives, where we raised our son, where we celebrated birthdays, Christmases, where we cried over losses and celebrated victories. The rose bushes Thomas had planted were still there, needing care but resisting. The small wooden gate he had made himself creaked in the same way when we opened it. Dorothy answered the door with a surprised expression that quickly turned defensive. She was dressed as if she were about to go out, in a flowery dress with her hair dyed an artificial brown that didn't match her age. "What do you want here?" she asked without inviting us into our own house. "To talk, Dorothy," I replied, keeping calm. "Just to talk." She looked at Thomas, then at Robert, and her face paled slightly. "I see you told them," she said with a forced smile. "Well, it was about time, wasn't it? 50-some years of lies. I imagine it was quite a shock for you too." The cruelty of those words, the satisfaction she seemed to feel from our suffering, hit me like a slap. This bitter woman in front of me was not the girl I grew up with, the sister I once loved. "Why, Dorothy?" was all I could ask. "Why do this to your own sister?" She shrugged with an indifference that cut my heart. "I needed the money, and you always had everything, didn't you? The perfect husband, the perfect son, the perfect little house." "While you—" "What?" Thomas interrupted, his voice firm. "While you went from one man to another, spending everything you earned, never settling down anywhere, is that Martha's fault?" "You don't know anything," Dorothy raised her voice. "You only know her side of the story. It's always been like this, since we were little. Martha, the model daughter, Daddy's favorite, and me, the black sheep, the one who never did anything right." I realized then that Dorothy's hurt came from much earlier, from our childhood, from wounds that never properly healed. It didn't justify what she had done, but at least it started to make sense. "Dorothy," I spoke softly, taking a step toward her. "I know we had our differences, that maybe I received more attention from our parents. But that was so long ago. We were children. Look at us now. We're two old ladies. You're the only family I have left besides Thomas and Robert." For an instant, I saw something waver in her eyes. A shadow of the girl I knew, of the sister who was once my playmate. But soon, her gaze hardened again. "Very nice speech, Martha. But it doesn't change anything. The house is mine now. Legally, you signed the papers. It was Robert who stepped forward. Actually, Aunt Dorothy, that's not quite right. He explained about the recording, about the lawsuit we were filing. With each word, Dorothy's face transformed from arrogant confidence to fear and finally to anger. "You can't prove anything," she shouted, completely losing her composure. "It'll be your word against mine." "The recording is quite clear, Aunt," Robert replied calmly. "You admitted to the extortion, confessed that you threatened my mother to take the house." Dorothy looked at the three of us, cornered like a trapped animal. For a moment, I thought she might physically attack us, such was the fury in her eyes. But then, unexpectedly, she collapsed in tears. "What do you want me to do?" she sobbed. "I've already spent part of the money from the sale. I have debts, people coming after me." It was Thomas, with his wisdom as a simple man who had lived a long life, who offered the solution. "The house hasn't been officially transferred to the buyer yet, has it? You just signed a sales agreement." Dorothy nodded between sobs. "Then undo the deal, return the down payment you received, say there was a family problem. We'll pay your most urgent debts within reason, and you can stay with us until you get back on your feet." I looked at my husband with surprise. After everything Dorothy had done, he was still offering help. But then I understood. It wasn't for Dorothy that he was doing this. It was for me, because he knew that despite everything, she was still my sister. "Why would you do this?" Dorothy asked suspiciously, wiping away tears. "Because we're family," I replied simply, "and family forgives. It might take time, it might be difficult, but family forgives." In the days that followed, with Mr. Mendez's help, we undid the house sale. The buyer, a businessman from Boston who wanted the property for investment, wasn't happy but agreed to take his money back with a small compensation for the inconvenience. Dorothy, after much reluctance, accepted our proposal. We paid her most urgent debts, which we discovered were mainly with loan sharks due to a disastrous investment in a clothing store. And she moved into the guest room of our house. The coexistence wasn't easy at first. There was a lot of hurt, a lot of distrust. Sometimes she would catch me looking at Thomas and Robert with a strange expression, as if she still couldn't believe they knew the truth and still accepted me. One night, about 2 weeks after we had recovered our house, I found Dorothy sitting alone on the porch, looking at the stars with a lost expression on her face. "May I join you?" I asked hesitantly. We were still learning to relate to each other again. She nodded, and I sat in the chair beside her. We remained silent for a few minutes, just observing the starry sky of Burlington, as beautiful as anywhere in the world. "You know what hurts the most?" she said finally, without looking at me. "It's that, deep down, I always knew you were the better one of us since we were kids. You were prettier, smarter, kinder. Everyone liked you more, and I hated that." Her words caught me by surprise. "Dorothy, that's not true. You were always the braver one, the more determined one. Remember how you confronted those boys who were teasing me at school? You weren't afraid of anyone." She gave a small smile, the first genuine one I had seen on her face in years. "That's true. I broke Tommy's nose with just one punch." We laughed together, remembering that distant day when she, at 11 years old, defended her older sister from the school bullies. "I think we lost each other somewhere along the way," I continued. "We grew up, took different paths, and that connection we had simply broke." Dorothy remained silent for a long moment. "I always envied you, Martha," she finally admitted. "Your life seemed so perfect compared to mine. Even with a secret that big, you managed to build a happy family, a stable life, while you always sought something, you didn't quite know what it was," I completed. "But it's never too late, you know? to start over, to do things differently. That night we didn't resolve all our differences, far from it, but we took the first step toward a reconciliation I didn't know was possible. And as we looked at the stars together, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced in a long time. The truth had finally come to light after more than 5 decades. The secret I carried as a burden no longer existed. And miraculously, my family not only survived the revelation, but somehow came out stronger from it. There was still much to rebuild, many difficult conversations ahead, but for the first time in so long, I could breathe freely, without the weight of the lie crushing my chest. And that, my dears, is priceless. 2 weeks after that conversation with Dorothy on the porch, I woke up in the middle of the night with a restlessness I couldn't explain. The clock showed 3:27 a.m., and Thomas slept peacefully beside me, his soft snoring like a familiar melody after so many decades sharing the same bed. I got up carefully not to wake him and went to the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was quiet. Dorothy had been asleep for hours in the guest room, which she gradually made her own with personal touches. A colorful quilt she had embroidered years ago, old photographs of our parents, a small vase of violets on the nightstand. I sat at the kitchen table, the same one where so many family meals had been shared over the years, and let my mind wander. Something was bothering me, a question that remained unanswered amid all that turmoil of emotions and revelations. What had happened to Richard? I never heard from him again after that November of 1969. He left for Portugal, as he had said, and disappeared from my life as abruptly as he had reappeared. At the time, immersed in the anguish of unexpected pregnancy and the fear of losing Thomas, I didn't try to find him. Maybe it was better that way. But now, after the truth had come out, after my husband and son had accepted the past and forgiven me, that question began to haunt me. Was Richard still alive? Had he started a family? And more importantly, should he know he had a son? Robert never showed interest in meeting his biological father. For him, Thomas was and would always be his only father. But I wondered if, as a mother, I had the right to keep this information hidden from Richard. He might have other children who would be half-siblings to Robert. There might be an entire family my son never knew. The next morning, as we were having coffee, I shared my thoughts with Thomas. "Do you think we should try to find Richard?" I asked uncertainly. My husband was silent for a moment, thoughtfully stirring his coffee with milk. His eyes, still alive despite his age, rested on mine with that quiet wisdom I always admired. "I think that's not our decision, Martha," he finally answered. "It's Robert's. If he wants to meet his biological father, we should support him. If he doesn't want to, we should respect that too." It was a sensible answer, as always. Thomas, even after everything, showed an understanding and generosity that left me speechless. How could I have doubted him 55 years ago? How could I have believed he wouldn't accept my pregnancy, that he wouldn't love me despite my mistake? That afternoon, when Robert came to visit with his wife and children, as he did every Sunday, I found the courage to bring up the subject. We were sitting in the backyard in the shade of the old maple tree that Thomas had planted when we moved into the house. The children were playing in the small garden we kept while we adults talked. "Son, there's something I need to ask you," I began, feeling my heart race. "Would you like to know more about Richard? Maybe even meet him if he's still alive?" Robert looked at me with surprise, then at Thomas, who nodded slightly, indicating he supported the conversation. My son, our son, remained silent for a long moment, his face reflecting the internal conflict he certainly felt. "I don't know, Mom," he answered honestly. "Part of me is curious, of course. It's natural to want to know where we come from, but another part fears this might, I don't know, complicate things somehow. How so complicate? I asked. What if he's a terrible person? What if he rejects any contact? Or worse, what if he suddenly wants to be part of my life after 55 years of absence? I don't know if I'm prepared for any of these possibilities. I perfectly understood his fears. They were valid, logical even. But there was also another side to the question. What if he's a good person who simply never knew he had a son? I pondered. What if he's alone now in his old age without family? I'm not saying you would need to develop a deep relationship, but maybe he has the right to know. Robert looked at Thomas, seeking his opinion. My husband, always sensible, shrugged with a small smile. Biological father or not, he's part of your story, son. Of our story. If you want to meet him, we'll be by your side. If you prefer to leave the past in the past, we'll understand that too. After much reflection, Robert decided that yes, he wanted to at least try to find out what had happened to Richard, not necessarily to establish a relationship, but to know this part of his origin, which had always been shrouded in mystery. That's how, on a Wednesday afternoon, Robert took me to a cafe in the town square. There, he opened his laptop and showed me a tool I barely understood. A social network where people could search for distant relatives, childhood friends, school colleagues. We'll need more information about him, Mom, he explained patiently. Full last name, date of birth, anything you remember. I closed my eyes, forcing my memory to go back more than half a century. Richard Taylor Anderson, I said slowly. Born in Morgantown, I think in 1944 or 45. He studied at the public high school, then left for New York when he was about 16. When I met him again in 69, he had just returned from a time in Europe. He talked about London, Paris, Lisbon. Robert typed rapidly as I spoke, entering these fragmented pieces of information into various fields on the screen. Anything else? Names of relatives, perhaps? I shook my head, frustrated with the limitations of my memory. His mother's name was Eleanor. I remember because she made wonderful cookies that she sold at the fair. His father, I don't recall the name, but he was a city hall employee. For weeks, Robert dedicated part of his free time to this search. He researched digitized public records, contacted former Morgantown residents through the internet, even wrote to the city hall requesting information about employees from that time. It was a slow and often discouraging process. Several leads led to dead ends. A Richard Taylor Anderson we found had died in 1985 in a car accident in upstate New York, but we later discovered it wasn't the same person. The dates didn't match. When we were already beginning to think about giving up, the first concrete clue came. Robert found on a Portuguese newspaper website a small note about the retirement of a Brazilian professor who had taught for decades at the University of Coimbra. The name was Richard T. Anderson. It must be a coincidence, I said, trying to control my hope. There must be many Richard T. Andersons in the world. But Robert didn't give up. Through contacts at the university where he worked, he got the email of a colleague from the Department of Civil Engineering at the University of Coimbra. He wrote a carefully crafted message, explaining that he was looking for an American professor named Richard Taylor Anderson, possibly born in Morgantown, West Virginia, who would have gone to Portugal in the late 60s. The response came 3 days later and left us breathless. I know Professor Richard well, the email said. He retired a few years ago but still lives in Coimbra. He is an American born in West Virginia. Yes, and he arrived in Portugal in 1970. Is this the man you're looking for? I can pass your contact to him if you wish. That night, we had a family meeting to decide how to proceed. I, Thomas, Robert, his wife Anna, and even Dorothy, who now participated more actively in our lives, gathered in the living room to discuss. We can't just send an email saying, "Hello, you have a 55-year-old son you never knew existed." Anna pondered, always practical. We need to be sensitive. What if he doesn't want to know? Dorothy questioned. Or worse, what if he wants to go to court, demanding some kind of inheritance or compensation? Thomas, who had been quiet until then, raised his hand, asking for silence. We're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to be sure it's really him. Then, Robert should decide how he wants to proceed. It's his life that will be most affected by this. Robert looked at each of us thoughtfully. I want to meet him, he finally said. Not to establish a father-son relationship. I already have a father, the best anyone could have, but out of curiosity, to know this other part of my history. We decided then that Robert would respond to the email requesting that a simple message be passed to Richard. An old acquaintance from Morgantown, West Virginia, would like to re-establish contact. If he showed interest, then we would proceed with more details. 3 days passed without a response, and we were already beginning to think Richard had ignored the message. Until Saturday morning when the phone rang. Robert had given his number in the contact email. I was in the kitchen when my son entered, his face pale, holding the cell phone as if it were something fragile that might break at any moment. It was him, he said simply. Richard, he's coming to the U.S. next month for a conference in New York. He wants to meet us in Burlington. I felt my legs weaken and needed to support myself on the table. After 55 years, I would see again the man who, in a brief passage through my life, had forever altered my destiny. Did you tell him? I asked, barely able to form the complete question. Robert shook his head. I only said I was the son of an old acquaintance of his from Morgantown, and that I had something important to discuss in person. He seemed intrigued, asked some questions, but I respected his request to tell everything in person. In the weeks that followed, my anxiety grew each day. What would it be like to see Richard again after so long? Would he have changed much? Would he have married, had other children? How would he react to the news that he had a 55-year-old son he never knew? And most importantly, how would this meeting between Robert and his biological father go? My son, always so self-assured, seemed increasingly nervous as the day approached. Thomas, on the other hand, maintained an admirable calm. His unwavering support for Robert, even knowing he was going to meet his biological father, only increased my love and admiration for this extraordinary man with whom I had shared my life. The appointed day was approaching, and with it, a new chapter in our family history was about to be written. A chapter that, unlike the previous ones, would not be built on secrets and lies, but on the truth, however difficult and complex it might be. The day that would forever mark our lives dawned with a fine, delicate drizzle, typical of the Vermont winter. I woke up even before the sun rose, after a night practically without sleep. Beside me, Thomas was also awake, looking at the ceiling, lost in thoughts I could only imagine. We intertwined our wrinkled hands in silence, communicating without words the whirlwind of emotions that crossed us. We had arranged to meet Richard at 3 p.m. at the Imperial Cafe, a traditional establishment in the central square of Burlington. Robert would pick us up at noon, giving enough time to arrive calmly and emotionally prepare for the moment. The morning dragged on with agonizing slowness. I changed clothes 3 times, undecided about what to wear for such an extraordinary meeting. I finally opted for a simple navy blue dress with a pearl necklace that Thomas had given me on our 40th wedding anniversary. I wanted to look presentable, but without seeming like I had overdressed for the occasion. Dorothy, who now actively participated in our family life, offered to prepare lunch, but no one managed to eat more than a few bites. The tension was palpable in the air, like electricity before a storm. "Are you sure you want me to come along?" Thomas asked when we were almost leaving. His calm voice didn't betray the emotion I knew he felt. "Absolutely," Robert replied, placing his hand on his father's shoulder. "You're my father in all the ways that matter. I want you there." That moment between the two men in my life moved me deeply. The genuine love between them, the father-son relationship built over decades, was stronger than any biological tie. The path to the center of town never seemed so long to me. The drizzle had given way to a cloudy sky, but without rain, casting a soft, melancholic light over the cobblestone streets and the historic buildings of Burlington. "What do you think he looks like?" I asked no one in particular, breaking the silence in the car. "The engineering professor I spoke with said he's very respected in Coimbra," Robert replied. "He advised dozens of theses, published important books in the field." "That's not what I asked," I said softly. "How do you think he looks physically? Has he changed much?" The truth is, I was trying to imagine what it would be like to see Richard after so many decades. The young man with an easy smile and bright eyes I knew in 1969 would now be a man of almost 80. Like me, he would have been transformed by time, by the joys and sorrows of life, by the choices we made. We arrived at the Imperial Cafe half an hour early. The establishment, which had existed since the 1940s, maintained an air of old elegance with its dark wooden tables, chairs upholstered in faded red velvet, and a marble counter where traditional Vermont pastries were displayed. We chose a table at the back from where we could see the entrance. Thomas ordered a coffee. I opted for chamomile tea, hoping to calm my nerves, and Robert didn't want anything. His fingers drummed restlessly on the table, betraying his anxiety. The minutes dragged on with excruciating slowness. Robert constantly checked the clock while Thomas looked out the window, apparently calm, but I knew that crease between his eyebrows, a sign of deep concentration or concern. At 2:57 p.m., the cafe door opened and my heart almost stopped. A tall man with completely white hair and upright posture entered, looking around with curiosity. Even after 55 years, even with all the transformations that time imposes, I recognized him immediately. It was Richard. He wore a light shirt under a blue blazer, well-cut pants, and polished shoes, the image of a retired university professor. His eyes behind thin-framed glasses still had that peculiar sparkle that had enchanted me so many years ago. But there was something more now. A serenity, a wisdom that only the years can bring. Our gazes met, and I saw immediate recognition in his eyes, followed by surprise, and then an emotion I couldn't decipher. He walked slowly to our table, his steps slightly hesitant. "Martha?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Is it really you?" I stood up, my legs trembling so much I thought I couldn't stand. "Hello, Richard," I managed to say, my voice barely more than a whisper. For a moment, we just looked at each other, two elderly people trying to see through the decades the young people we once were. Then, with a gentleness that caught me by surprise, he took my hands in his. "So many years," he murmured. "You look beautiful." The courtesy made me smile despite the tension. We were both elderly now, with wrinkles, white hair, and the numerous signs that life leaves on us. But there was a sincerity in his words that touched me. Coming out of my trance, I indicated the others at the table. "Richard, this is my husband, Thomas." The two men measured each other for a moment before exchanging a formal handshake, more educated than warm. The situation was so surreal it almost seemed like a movie scene. My husband of 55 years greeting the man with whom I had briefly been involved before we got married. "And this," I continued, my voice faltering slightly, "is Robert, our son." I saw Richard's eyes study Robert with curiosity. Undoubtedly, he was intrigued about why the son of an old acquaintance wanted to meet him so badly. Robert, in turn, stared fixedly at Richard, as if trying to memorize every detail of the face of the man who, unknowingly, was his biological father. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir," Robert said formally, extending his hand. We all sat down, and for a few moments no one knew what to say. The waitress came, momentarily breaking the tension, and Richard ordered a coffee. When she walked away, he looked at each of us expectantly. "I confess I'm curious," he finally said. "Your message was quite mysterious, Robert. What's so important for us to discuss?" Robert looked at me as if asking permission to proceed. I nodded slightly, feeling Thomas's silent support beside me. "Mr. Anderson," Robert began, his voice firmer than I expected, "the reason for this meeting is that I recently discovered you are my biological father." The coffee Richard was bringing to his lips stopped midway. His eyes, wide with shock, moved quickly from Robert to me and back to Robert. "What? How is that possible?" he asked, placing the cup back on the saucer with visibly trembling hands. It was then that we told the whole story, taking turns with the most difficult parts. I talked about our brief relationship in 1969, about how I discovered the pregnancy only after he left for Portugal, about how I hid the truth from Thomas. Robert explained how the truth came to light recently because of Dorothy's blackmail. Thomas, surprisingly, also participated, telling how he had accepted Robert as his son regardless of blood ties. Richard listened to everything in silence, his face a mask of complex emotions. When we finished, he remained quiet for a long moment, looking at the now cold coffee cup in front of him. 55 years, he finally said, his voice almost inaudible. A son for 55 years, and I never knew. "I never tried to find you, Richard," I admitted. "At the time I was so afraid, so desperate. I was only thinking about saving my engagement to Thomas, about avoiding scandal in the small town. Later, when Robert was born, when we started our life in Burlington, it was simply understood that Thomas was the father, and he was in all ways that matter." Richard nodded slowly, still processing everything. "I understand why you did it, Martha. Those were different times, different circumstances. I don't blame you." He then turned to Robert, and I saw his eyes fill with tears. "But I lost the chance to know you, son, to see you grow up, to be part of your life." "You're a university professor?" Robert asked, gently changing the direction of the conversation. Richard seemed grateful for the opportunity to talk about his life. "Yes, I taught civil engineering at the University of Coimbra for almost 40 years. I retired 5 years ago, but I still advise some doctoral students. I'm also an engineer," Robert said with a small smile. "Maybe I take after you." I saw something light up in Richard's face, a connection, a recognition that transcended the time and distance that separated him from his son. "That's remarkable," he replied, his voice choked. The conversation flowed more easily after that. Richard told us about his life in Portugal, how he had settled there, built a respectable career. He had married a Portuguese woman, but the marriage lasted only 7 years and they had no children. After that, he dedicated himself entirely to his academic career, becoming a reference in his field. "I never had any more children," he said, looking at Robert with an emotion that was almost palpable. "I always felt something was missing in my life, but I never knew exactly what. Now I understand." When the cafe began to empty as evening approached, Richard asked the question that had clearly tormented him since the beginning of the conversation. "And now? What happens after today?" It was Robert who answered, after exchanging a look with Thomas. "That depends on you, too. I'm not looking for a father. I already have one, the best anyone could wish for. But maybe we can get to know each other better. I have children, your biological grandchildren. Maybe they could meet you too." Richard's eyes lit up at the mention of grandchildren. "I would like that very much." We arranged then for Richard to extend his stay in the U.S. He would come to Burlington after the conference in New York and spend a few days with us, getting to know Robert better, his children, our family. When we finally said goodbye at the door of the cafe, Richard hugged me briefly. "Thank you for looking for me even after so much time," he whispered. "You could have taken this secret to the grave, but you chose to give me this chance." "Everyone deserves to know their complete history," I replied simply. On the way back home, a thoughtful silence filled the car. Each of us was absorbed in our own reflections about the meeting, about the complex emotions it had aroused. "Are you okay?" I asked Thomas, squeezing his hand. My husband looked at me with those eyes that knew every bit of my soul. "I am," he answered sincerely. "It was different from what I imagined, but I'm at peace." Robert, driving, looked at us through the rear-view mirror. "He seems like a good man." "Yes," I agreed. "He always was." When we arrived home, Dorothy was waiting anxiously for news. We told her everything, and she listened with unusual attention, asking occasional questions. "And you, Thomas?" she finally asked. "How do you feel seeing your son meet his biological father?" My husband thought for a moment before answering. "You know, Dorothy, when you reach 85 like me, you realize life is much more complicated than we imagined when we were young. It's not black and white, right or wrong. It's full of nuances, situations we never imagined facing. Richard is not a threat to me because I know who I am in Robert's life. I know what we built together." His words, so simple and so profound, brought tears to my eyes. This extraordinary man, who accepted me with all my mistakes and secrets, who loved Robert as his own blood, continued to surprise me with his wisdom and kindness. That night, lying beside Thomas in our bed, I reflected on the incredible journey our life had been. From a secret kept for decades, through the painful blackmail, the frightening revelation, to this new chapter that was opening now, with Richard entering our lives, not as a threat to what we built, but as an addition, an extension of our family history. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, caressing my white hair. "About how life comes full circle," I replied. "About how what seemed like a tragedy, Dorothy discovering my diary, the blackmail, the temporary loss of our house, ended up bringing us here, to the truth, to the liberation from this secret I carried for so long." Thomas nodded, understanding as always. "Sometimes, Martha, we need to lose something to realize what really matters. We need to face our biggest fears to discover they weren't as scary as we imagined." I fell asleep in the arms of the man who had been my safe harbor for more than half a century, feeling a peace I hadn't experienced in a very, very long time. The secret I carried as a heavy burden for decades had finally transformed into an open, shared, accepted story. And I realized at that moment between sleep and wakefulness that the true miracle wasn't just that Thomas and Robert had forgiven me, or that Richard had entered our lives so graciously. The true miracle was that after everything, I had finally learned to forgive myself. So, my dears watching me now, I want to leave this final message. No matter how heavy the secret you carry, no matter how much time has passed, The truth, however painful it may be at the moment, brings with it a liberation that no lie, however comfortable it may seem, can ever offer. Life is too short to live trapped in cages we ourselves build. Believe this old lady who took almost a lifetime to learn this lesson. True love, whether from a partner, a child, or even a sibling, is strong enough to overcome our mistakes, our weaknesses, our deepest fears. And now, if you liked this story, this part of my life that I shared with you today, don't forget to leave your like, subscribe to the Grandma's Diary channel, and tell me in the comments if you've ever gone through a similar